I moved into my family's hunting lodge because I had nowhere else to go. The highway thinned into 2 lanes of cracked asphalt, and the trees closed in until they were a tunnel of trunks and needles. They leaned toward the road like neighbors leaning over a fence to watch you pass. Too close, too curious. The last stretch was a gravel track that spat my tires and smelled like crushed pine and rot. When Blackwater Lodge came into view, it sat where it always had, squat and stubborn against the lake, its porch sagging as if someone had let go of a rope. The sky was the color of old pewter. Up close, it was larger and older than I remembered. The cedar siding had gone silver. The windows reflected the trees like a second skin. A pair of deer heads flanked the door. Their glass eyes caught the light and held it without giving anything back. I stood in the gravel and thought of how little inheritance really means when you inherit the whole of a thing that remembers people longer than people remember themselves. Inside smelled like mothballs and smoke and winter coats that had been folded and left folded for too long. Long shadows pooled along the floorboards. The fireplace was a black mouth. On the mantel, between an antler and a chipped plate that read Rays, there was a single sheet of paper, a thin piece of yellowed typing paper someone had fed through a metal carriage many times over. The header was blunt. House rules for whoever stays after dark. I remember reading it in a noiseless, almost holy way, like you read the rules of a place you mean to obey. The type was uniform and patient. Someone had underlined a few lines in pencil. Others were crossed out, as if the rules had been argued with and then surrendered to. 1. Lock exterior doors at sunset. Once locked, do not unlock until morning. 2. If someone knocks after dark, you did not hear it. 3. Do not open curtains or blinds between midnight and 3 a.m. 4. If the fireplace lights itself, do not turn away. Bring it back to flame until it is satisfied. 5. Mounted heads are watchers. Do not move them, do not count them, do not speak of them as decoration. 6. Do not answer any call that mimics the voice of the dead. 7. Never let the lodge feel like home. If it does, leave immediately and do not return. 8. Keep the ledger up to date. Paper remembers what people forget. 9. Never go into the basement after midnight unless the ledger instructs you. 10. If a window bows inward, board it and do not sleep in the room it faces. 11. Do not feed the things at the edge of the tree line. 12. Teach the rules to the next person if you must stay. If you refuse, write so it can find no purchase. They looked like a joke. They looked like superstition. I laughed in the doorway at the absurdity and at how my laugh sounded small in that big, empty room. I told myself I was being dramatic because people love drama where there is none. My breakup had left me hungry for a narrative bigger than my own missteps.
The lodge was far enough from anything to be good for writing. The bank wanted me to clear the property taxes. My name was already on the deed. It seemed sensible, in the way that desperation makes sensible things look like salvation. I locked the back door before the light went all the way. I knew how to bolt a deadbolt without vibrating it loose. Ray had shown me once, many summers ago, when I was small enough to fit under his elbow as he worked the chain. Lock the doors at sunset. Rule 1. I told myself that was the important thing. Lock the doors and the rest will make itself dull like a rumor. If you want the whole story, stay with me. The first night I made coffee and burned low in the fireplace until the ash was almost nothing. I slept in the front room on an air mattress pulled beneath a faded quilt. For most of the night the lodge behaved exactly like a house when absence has eaten at it, settling bored voices, slow breaths through pipes, the little groan of metal cooler than bone against the wind. I caught myself listening for any sign of an imagined life that used to own these rooms. Sometimes memory is an intruder you can't evict. At 11:34 p.m., there were 3 slow knocks at the side door. I woke because the knock is a noise that knows certain keyholes in a person. It was not the skittering of raccoons or a loose shutter. It came with the cadence of someone precise, patient. 1, 2, 3. The time read like an accusation on my phone when I fumbled for it. 11:34. My hands were under the quilt, my heart in my throat, and in the hallway a voice answered the knock in a way only a person who was both past and present could. My grandfather's old voice, muddy and familiar, calling my name like he was poking at something in the dark. "Mary," he said. He always called me Mary when he wanted to get under formalities, like a fisherman dropping bait. His Mary carried the smell of pipe tobacco and the rust on his truck keys and the way he used to tuck the quilt up under my chin. He'd been dead 2 years. I could say that and the letters still look like fact. He had a funeral, there was a stone, and a chair pulled up to the mantel where his hat used to sit. There are facts you keep because the world makes them insist. I did not open the door. I watched the knob turn in my mind a number of times. I thought about the rules as if they were a thin cloth between me and a precipice. If someone knocks after dark, you did not hear it. Rule 2. Do not open. Do not answer. I told myself grandfather was a trick of memory. I told myself I heard an old recording in my head. I told myself anything I could until honesty felt like another kind of pain. The knocking stopped after 3 rounds. The house held its breath for a long moment. It was the kind of silence that is not empty so much as full of things waiting to be spoken. I lay awake until the black mouth of the fireplace cooled again.
At 3 in the morning, I counted the breath of the house with my own and tried, ineffectually, to sleep. Do not go down to the basement at odd hours. Don't make it feel like home. There was a crackle, a breath. Mara, if you hear a voice that sounds like me after I'm gone, if I'm tapping at a door, you do nothing. You think of the lock. You think of the ledger. You think of leaving. He said my name with a tenderness that was almost cruel. You're stubborn like your mother. That's good. Be stubborn at the right walls. I pressed my forehead to the tape player because archaic devices make intimacy into something tactile. The tape was not an instruction manual. It was a plea. The ledger and the tape together read like a man who had folded himself small around a responsibility until it was the only thing keeping him from being carried off. The pages smelled of nicotine and varnish and the dry, acidic odor of old paper. They made the room smaller and older. I called Eli because that's what you do when you want at least one sane person to witness your instability. Eli and I had grown up as cousins who shared summers and secrets and the hollow of a lake where we had taught each other to skip stones. He answered on the second ring, no voicemail. Even his voice on the phone had a relief to it, like he was surprised I was calling him for something besides birthday texts. "You're actually there?" he said, and there was the old cadence between us, the way we could always fall back into family shorthand. "Yeah," I said. "I'm renting the place. For now." "Are you sure about that?" He laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that has an edge, caution disguised as mockery. He said he could be there in the afternoon if I wanted help with the basics. A little of my old life, someone who would appear when you called, came back into being. I felt steadier. When Eli drove up the lane a few days later, he carried a duffel and a skepticism like a blanket. He is pragmatic in a quiet way that makes you trust him. He ate the sandwiches I made like a man who believed in sandwiches first, and then the world. We hauled boxes up. We patched a sagging screen door. We argued about whether the Wi-Fi dongle would reach the living room at all. He was a ballast for normalcy, and I cherished the tug. When Reed drove up the lane a few days later, he carried a duffel and a skepticism like a blanket. He is pragmatic in a quiet way that makes you trust him.
He ate the sandwiches I made like a man who believed in sandwiches first, and then the world. We hauled boxes up. We patched a sagging screen door. We argued about whether the Wi-Fi dongle would reach the living room at all. He was a ballast for normalcy, and I cherished the tug. When Reed drove up the lane a few days later, he carried a duffel and a skepticism like a blanket. He was a figure who had been in every town rumor and story, a local hunter whose eyes were shaded by a lifetime of watching. He wore the same hat in every photograph I remembered, and in person it looked like a soft planet on his head. He had the slow sort of speech people get when they've practiced speaking without provoking certain things into answering. "You shouldn't be staying," Reed said when Eli introduced us. His hands stayed on his truck like anchors. He had the voice of someone who would tell the truth even if people hated him for it. "Why?" I asked, and it came out sharper than I meant.
"Because it starts to learn you," he said, and there was an economy to his wording that made it feel like a proverb. Because people think the lodge will keep them because they keep it. It's the other way around sometimes. We punted the small talk away. Reed's eyes slid to the deer heads on the porch, and his jaw tightened. He knew what they were. He knew what everything on that house meant in the same way a carpenter knows where a beam will give. "Mounts watch," he said. "They don't notice you like family does. They notice you like a new instrument on a shelf." He squinted at the ledger that sat folded like a map I couldn't yet read. "Ray tried to teach people the rules," Reed said, "pulled them under like he was mending nets. Some of them stayed, some of them left. The ones that left, they didn't always get far." Eli made a face. "You're being dramatic," he said, but his hand drifted toward the back pocket of his jeans, where a pocket knife lived. He was joking because that's what you do when you want your laughter to stand between you and fear. Reed was matter-of-fact, and he brought the ledger up as proof the lodge preferred to work as an economy. He told us about the logging crew that fractured the shoreline decades ago, about Samuel Halpern, our great-grandfather, who first made the lodge a place people stayed in winter and seemed to wake something up that had been sleeping in the lake. He spoke of stone formations on the edge of Blackwater Lake that the native men used to avoid, of the fishermen who would come back to shore with nets full of fish that had no eyes, and of nights where the porch would be full of footprints that never moved past the tree line. He named Tom Carver and Jim Lewin, the two men whose departures were listed in Ray's ledger like unpaid fines. Tom found calling by a joke, Reed said. Jim, Lewin, kept counting the mounts, thought it was funny. The lodge doesn't like being counted, makes it nervous, makes it tidy that way. Reed told us simple rules in a way that typed sheet could not. He put weight behind them. "Leave the ledger out so it can be seen," he said. "If the fire lights itself, don't turn your back. Keep it polite, keep it boring. If it gets loud, you get quieter. If it makes a sound like someone you love, you answer with silence." He sat at the edge of the porch and watched the tree line as if it could reply. "It watches the way people watch for weather," he said. "It learns names out of habit. It will speak back what it learns, but it takes the practice for itself first." He gave us the past like a ledger too, each entry a small illumination. "Leaving is easier at first," he said, "but the longer you stay, the better it knows what to mirror. It can make you miss things you never thought you'd miss." I listened and felt that old humiliating ache of rooting in old soil for a life where the roots had been plucked up. The ledger felt heavier in my hands.
The rules, which had once looked like a prop, started to look like stitches. That night I reread Ray's pages. He had written dates and short accounts, the kind men write when they don't trust memory to survive mourning. There were small clinical entries like 9/13/87, door bowed inward, boarded, no footprints beyond porch, that read like property notes, and then in the margins and admission. No one else believed in the knocking. I believed because it kept my hands busy. Another page recorded, "Voicemail 2:47 a.m., M. Halpern, sound of voice like Ray, advised not to open, saved Eli's farm." That last line was underlined twice. I don't know if I should have let myself be scared by a man's handwriting. It is easier to be frightened by an idea than by the weathered human evidence of a struggle to hold things at bay. But the ledger also contains something else, a typed letter, Ray's last or last known, the one he must have written when the staying got harder than his bones. "If anything happens," he had typed, then hit the keys again in cruder letters. "Do not be clever. Do not try to make bargains. Teach or write that you refuse. Paper remembers." The more I read, the less comfort I found in rational explanations. The scratching at the door was visible. The tape had my grandfather's voice on it. The pages recorded people who had been foolish, and sometimes people who had been careful. The lodge behaved like a thing that gathered rules around itself like a hunter packs a knife. When Eli left that evening to get more bolts and a can of boarding nails, we locked the back door and set a chair against it, because it felt like we had to make gestures that were larger than teeth. We didn't talk about the 3 knocks. We didn't have to. The energy in the room was a taut wire. Sometimes, in the quiet that follows the reading of a ledger and the listening of a tape and the being shown the history of a place, your brain offers you cheap metaphors. I thought of the lodge like a patient who'd been trained into being sick. It learned routines, it learned responses, it cataloged. That made the rules not strange but efficient. It made them a maintenance schedule for a machine that had been fed people for generations. So I did the sensible thing I always do when I am afraid. I kept working. I wrote a list of repairs, of phone calls to the county about property tax, of who would bring wood and who would build a proper shelf to hold the ledger. The work kept my hands busy and my head from slipping into superstitions that could be demonstrated only by silence and absence. But work is the kind of thing that expects a future and obeys its own faith of continuity. The lodge tested that by making the past present. At dinner, the fireplace lit itself to scorch my pan in an old habit of hospitality. I watched the flame gather and lick with emotion that seemed less chemical than intentional. It hissed like something settling into its throat.
As if the rule on the mantel had not only been printed but pressed into the wood and learned how to bite. I caught myself looking at the flame and thinking of Rule 4. If the fireplace lights itself, do not turn away. Bring it back to flame until it is satisfied. I fed it a dry twig like a penance, then another, because the ledger and the tape and reed had taught me to be ridiculous and follow instructions like a prayer. The fire burned and took what I gave without complaint. It was a small compliance and it felt like buying time. The lodge is a thing that observes manners. In the days that followed, I watched the way it catalogued my obedience and tested how much I would give for the sake of being left in peace. It also showed me, like all good predators, that it preferred negotiation to violence. The ledger entry suggested that those who tried to bargain with land or law tended not to learn as fast as the place did. Those who obeyed had a different fate. They were kept. Eli slept in the guest room. He didn't look at the deer heads. He joked about hunting and how ridiculous it was to be creeped out in a place that had been in our family for generations. That kind of humor is an attempt to anchor someone in daylight. It worked for a while. There were things I did not tell him. I did not tell him how at 2:47 a.m., when I could not sleep, my phone lit with a recorded voicemail that played his grandfather's voice in the raw electrical echo of a machine. The recording was short, the kind of clipped audio that suggests a life sentence of being unable to rest. "Mara," the voicemail said, in Ray's voice, like a hand through the static. "You lock the doors. Ledger on the desk. Teach or write you refused." Phones lie as much as they tell the truth. You can call it a glitch, a hacked file, the result of old numbers being shuffled by bad service. But inside the lodge, even technology is tempered to be a mirror. The voicemail felt like the ledger spoken, like a page folded inside a bone. I woke Eli with it, and he swore and then tried to lighten the sound with a joke. We both laughed at how childish our fear was, the laugh of people trying to compete with a shadow. There were nights after that when I woke thinking about the phrase, "If the lodge feels like home, leave." It is an instruction that is merciful in its cruelty, because it admits that the right thing is not to stay. It is an instruction that remembers that some places insist on being inhabited by more than one kind of owner. Reed came back the following day with a thermos and a small pile of hand-drawn maps. He sat at the kitchen table and folded his hands around the thermos as if trying to warm his rests against something that had been chilled by habit. He told us a story about a man named Carver who refused to obey a simple rule: do not open curtains between midnight and 3 a.m.
And how the man vanished in the hours after he did, leaving a chair with a cup of coffee still steaming. Reed's voice was dull, like a tool, and it had the effect of making those facts harder to box into fantasy. Eli bristled, as he had a right to do. His bristle was the bristle of someone who'd prefer to believe the world is a reasonable place unless proven otherwise. I wanted to believe the same. I wanted my life to be an argument I could win with logic and a subscription to a streaming service. The ledger and the tape and the scratch marks refused to let me have that tidy ending. We walked the property after Reed spoke, circling the tree line like people trying to read the margin of a map. There were stones set near the water, old and square and stacked like someone had tried to write in granite. The fishermen's cabins were shuttered and thin as shells. An old dock jutted out into Blackwater and sagged where men had once lowered boats. The lake was a flat glass that refused reflection that afternoon. It was like looking at a face you could not quite recognize because every feature had learned to look away when you tried to see it. That night I locked the doors as Ray had told me. I set the ledger on the end table and opened it to a fresh page. I took a pen because the rules had been specific. Paper remembers. I wrote the date and scribbled my name, and then an admission. I am staying for now. The pen felt heavy. The ink bled a little on the cheap paper. There is a moment in the ledger writing that feels like sewing a seam. You push the needle through and you hope the fabric holds. I made the seam, and it felt like setting a small marker that said, for better or worse, that I was trying. When it was late, the house settled, and the wind smoothed into a low sound that might have been sleep. I imagined the knock would not come again. I imagined that the scrapbook of rules would function as a firewall, an arrangement of ritual that meant nothing more than quiet. But the ledger had other ideas. The house, like a patient who has grown used to certain attention, has requirements. Rules like calendars. I could live by them, or I could fail to see the day coming. I did not know yet how the lodge interprets fidelity, or what it asks in return for the small mercies of silence. I only knew that the rules were not suggestions. They were not even guidance. They were, for Ray and for many before him, the only way to keep whatever lurked at the edge of the trees from pulling the threads of your life through its teeth. When I turned off the lamp and lay in the dark, I read the typed rules one more time like a prayer, because prayers are the business of people who are not yet ready to be saints, and not yet ready to be monsters. Rule by rule, they had a rhythm I could tell myself I understood. Locking doors, ignoring knocks, keeping the ledger. These things were simple behaviors. They were also small fortifications for a person who was being taught not to be seen. Down in the study where the ledger sat with its soft spine, the house made a noise like a page being turned. I do not know whether the lodge wanted me to hear that sound, or whether the sound had always been there and I had finally learned where to listen for it. I only know my throat tightened, and I reached for the pen as if to write something that would keep me from dissolving. When dawn kept its distance, and the sky was the pale, thin blue of a mouth that cannot decide what it will say, Reed left with his thermos and a warning that was not a promise. "It's easier to leave now," he said. "It's easier to make a choice at the beginning than after the thing learns where you sleep." Eli watched him go, and then turned to me and asked quietly what I planned to do. The ledger was open and the ink still wet in the little admission I had written. For the first time since I inherited the deed, the property felt less like my burden and more like something with expectations. I hugged a mug until my knuckles went white, and then I put the ledger back under the paperweight. The rules were stitched into the house. They were stitches people had sewn to keep the wound from growing. We had not yet reached the night that would change the ledger's margin, the night that would test the seams. We had not yet had the storm that would bring voices, or the hour when the curtain would be opened and the mounts would turn. I did not yet know how the lodge would begin to ask for me, how it would practice my name and then call it in the dark. But even in those days of mundane chores and small reparations, the house was patient. It waits for people to get bored enough to make a mistake. It waits for people to ache enough to answer their own names when someone else calls them. It waits, and it learns the cadence of refusal. I told myself I would be careful. I told myself I would teach Eli the rules, that we would sleep with both doors bolted, that we would only feed the fireplace with the dry wood I had stacked. I imagined myself as a guardian of a ridiculous tradition, a woman who had the good sense to listen to the past and to keep its mistakes from beginning again. If only it were that tidy. The ledger, like all patient things, kept its own time. The rule sheet on the mantel, the scratches at the back door, the cassette with my grandfather's voice, each was a note in a tune I had not yet learned to dance to. The house seemed quieter the day before the storm. The sky had a bruise on its edge. I remember thinking, with the small, fierce optimism of someone terrified of fear, that knowledge here was safety. Obeying the rules would be the same thing as escaping. It had not been that way for Ray. It had not been that way for Samuel. It had not been that way for Tom and Lewin. Those names sat in the ledger like abstract warnings. And yet, I stayed.
I did not want to be the kind of person who ran from inherited obligations simply because they frightened her. I told myself I could maintain both the house and my life. I would keep the ledger up to date, and I would check the locks. I would be stubborn at the right walls. There were parts of that stubbornness that were pride, and parts that were economy. The taxes were due, and the bank did not accept spiritual explanations. The job prospects I had in town were small and not worth uprooting over an inheritance that required more than money. There were practical reasons that married to the more embarrassing ones, a habit of being the one who sees things through. The ledger is a clever teacher. It rewards human stubbornness with small mercies because it is building a pattern. It wants stability and learns people's routines like a recipe. I thought I could outmaneuver a recipe. I was not yet fully acquainted with the way recipes learn to add you as an ingredient. That evening, before the storm the forecast promised, I made one more entry in the ledger. I dated it and wrote the small details of the day. I recorded the civilized things, who had come and who had left, who had brought bolts, who had eaten what for lunch, because Ray had written it in the margins like an incantation. I wanted, selfishly, to make sure the paper had my handwriting in case anything wanted to claim it later. The house listened. The trees leaned. The sky held its breath like a trapped thing. The rules sat on the mantel like a thin, patient jury. I put the pen down and let my fingers rest on the ledger's spine as if to calm it, because that was how people are. We tell ourselves that by writing things down, we can contain them. When the first rain came, it was the sound of a sheet being snapped on a line. The house smelled of wet cedar. The lake darkened to the color of old coins. Reed's truck was a silhouette on the lane. Eli tightened a nail into boarding and joked that maybe we were making a fort. The lodge took the joke in and kept it. We did not yet know the kinds of questions the lodge would ask next. We did not yet know its patience was a long game. We did not know how it would practice our names until those names felt like echoes. We did not know when the rain began that it was only a sound, the basic sound of weather, but that something else in the place would answer it with an imitation, until the imitation leaned so close we would not be able to tell the difference. The storm arrived as if it had been rehearsing itself. First a low, impatient bruise on the horizon, then a long roll of distant thunder, then rain that scribbled itself across the windows in a dozen tiny, urgent hands. That night, the lodge inhaled wet cedar and old smoke and seemed to straighten, as if preparing to be examined. Eli stayed. He insisted he wasn't leaving me alone, and he did not speak of running unless the word was a joke that kept his throat from closing.
We boarded the sagging porch farther than I thought necessary, nailed sheets over the smallest windows, tied extra rope to the chain on the back door. At 9:47, while we were arguing about the placement of a tarp, the fireplace lit itself. It began as a single orange rosette in the black heart of the hearth. I watched my breath steam in the lamplight while the flame folded itself together and rose like a small animal remembering where to live. It smelled like burning resin and something older, like the inside of an attic where some forgotten person had kept all the letters no one had time to bury. If the fireplace lights itself, do not turn away. Bring it back to flame until it is satisfied. I heard the rule in my head like a chant. I fed the fire because rules had become a contract for me. Wet wood, dry kindling, the motion of pushing air with the poker. The flame hungrily accepted. It curled, licked the cast iron, and then, soft as a throat clearing, it made a sound that was not the house's normal settling. At first, it sounded like wind. Then it arranged itself into syllables that sounded like belonging, like that small lie people tell themselves about a place they love. It spoke, and when it spoke, it used voices the house had been collecting for years. Mary, it said, slow and layered. The sound came from inside the blaze, from the crackle and the steam, and it had my grandfather's cadence, the particular way he drew the syllables out when he wanted to make a point. I had heard that voice on the tape and in the voicemail, but hearing it folded into the flame was different. It was intimate in a way that felt like betrayal. I kept the poker in the fire. I fed a long stick until my arms ached. I did not let the flame go cold. It wanted attention. It wanted the movement, the obedience. Eli sat on the far couch and stared at me like I was a problem he couldn't solve with the toolbox. "Is this?" he began. "It's the rule," I said. "We do it." We did it. We watched the house watch us perform what it required. Later, when the rain was a live thing hammering the roof, the curtains in the front room shifted as if someone had stood behind them and breathed. There is a time the ledger marks in stark clerical tone, midnight to 3 a.m., when curtains are not to be opened. Rule 3. We all know it. We all agree that nobody should know why. The lodge is full of things that narrow your gaze until you follow the rules in a kind of prayer. At a little after midnight, the curtain by the bay window drew itself aside. It wasn't the slow sliding of a rod. It didn't part because of a wind. It folded back as if pushed by hands. A column of dark unstitched itself from the tree line and stepped into the glass, tall and thin as a ledger entry. For a heart-stopping second, I thought it was just a
a trick of wet branches and porch light. Then the mounted heads turned. They don't swivel like people.
They pivot with a mechanical deliberation, like cogs shifted by an unseen hand. The buck on the left moved first, a negligible tick in the jaw that broke its painted smile enough to be noticed. Glass eyes caught the light and refocused, as if they had been given a lens. One by one, the mounts on the wall shifted, until the room felt observed in a way that was not the same as being seen by a living face. It was the precise, clinical glance a judge gives an accused thing before reading out the sentence. "Do not move them," Reed had told us. "Don't count them. Don't speak of them as decoration." Eli muttered something that might have been a joke. The animal heads aligned as if they had been rehearsing for our arrival. The curtain opened wider, and for a fraction of a second the glass held a reflection that was not ours. I saw, pressed against the pane on the outside, a figure that was like my outline but wrong. Its head set at a tilt my own neck never took, its hands long-fingered, the silhouette stitching itself against the rain. A knock came from every direction at once, the house making use of metal and wood to make rhythm. It began with one steady, patient set of 3 taps at the side door, a cadence I'd learned to catalog. 3 slow knuckles, pause, 3 slow knuckles. My phone read 11:34 when I checked it without thinking. Times are hatpins through my memory now. The voice that answered the knock, as before, sounded like my grandfather, only this time it layered, so that there was a chorus in it, an old voice and something younger, and something with a cadence like a broadcast. Mary, Mary, Mary. It used the familiar nickname until I stomach lurch. Rule 2 says, if someone knocks after dark, you did not hear it. Rule 6 says, do not answer any call that mimics the voice of the dead. I heard the rules like they were a rope to hold myself upright. I did not open the door, neither did Eli. We slid into motion we had been practicing, bolts, chain, chair against the slab. When you perform the ritual taught by someone who learned how to bargain with a place, the motions themselves become small protections. We had made them into muscle memory. The knocking went on. Then it changed pitch and tempo and tried to be other things. Sometimes it sounded like someone dragging a sack. Sometimes it sounded like a mother's knuckle on an old piano. It used fragments of voices that belonged to people who had once left goodbyes at our doorstep. Eli, it said at one point. The sound plucked from my cousin's sleep and mangled into invitation. He took a breath and gripped the arm of the couch like a rope. Don't, I said. The house is patient. It prefers to teach than to kill. It has a pedagogy. It pushes, tests, retreats, learns your thresholds. At some point, how long I cannot say, the sound shifted from the side door to the basement. We heard a slow scrape of wood from below, the sound of a heavy thing being moved.
The brass doorknob at the foot of the stair began to turn. No, Reed had said. Never go down unless the ledger instructs. Rule 9 hung between us like another breath. It was 3:33 a.m. when the basement door opened. The numbering of the hours now tells me the shape of events, as if time were an index. The house keeps its own clock when it wants to. The floorboards near the stairs creaked like an animal pacing, and then something moved across the kitchen floor, slow and careful, leaving wet tracks that did not show up on the wood the way footmarks do. The inside of the window bowed, like a sigh pulling glass inward. It took the breath of air from the room. Rule 10. If a window bows inward, board it and do not sleep in the room it faces. One window bowed and then gave a sound like an oar breaking. Glass hammered inward in long, thin shards, and a cold so precise it felt surgical slid into the house. Nothing came through. There was no form that stepped into the opening. It was as if the lodge wanted us to see the vulnerability so we would be persuaded to obey. We ran. I don't mean that we walked with purpose or exited calmly. We ran as 2 people who had been taught how to run by an animal that had learned to be quiet. We dragged what we could carry: wallet, keys, some blankets. Eli grabbed the laptop out of a shock of practicality. He said he wanted to document the boardings later. Reed's thermos sat untouched on the porch with his last admonition ringing in my ears. Leaving is easier now. We didn't make it to the truck. The storm had turned into a blunt thing, rain driving against our faces like a test. The porch pitched underfoot. When we reached the gravel, it felt as if we had been hitting the inside of a bell. The lodge was behind us, a hulking silhouette. The porch light flicked with the wind, and then steady dimmed, as if someone had chosen the wattage for the night. We got in the car and drove. I watched the property recede through the rearview mirror, the sag of the roof, the deer heads perfectly still, the trees that leaned as if in courtesy, and felt a shape inside of me unhook.
It is strange that the relief of leaving can be as acute as the pull to return. For a few miles, the radio played static like a lullaby, then silence. Eli kept his hands tight on the wheel and counted small things. In the morning, the sheriff came. He was patient in the blunt, bureaucratic way people are who have seen oddness and learned to fold it into procedure. Reports, photographs, fingerprint kits. They measured the bowed window. They took pictures of the scratches at the back door that had deepened as if claws had insisted on trying again. They filed it under vandalism unknown and open investigation, and then their duty required a polite exit. People in uniforms are good at noting facts and bad at naming what they can't fit on a form. We drove away with plywood in the back seat and a bill for emergency repairs that would go unpaid for weeks.
The ledger lay like a small, disgraced Bible on the passenger seat. I had written the night's events in a shaking hand, times, sounds, the word voices underlined twice, and then closed it because entry felt like an obligation and also like feeding something. For a while, that felt like survival. We stayed in town. Eli slept on a futon at his place and called every morning. I tried work at a coffee shop that smelled like caramel and other people's plans. I applied for jobs, and every interview was a performance where I tried to appear unscarred, competent, employable. But leaving is not a bar. It is a threshold that a patient thing will wait beside. Reed's warning was a kind of map generating itself. The longer you stay out of the house, the more the lodge practices absence, until absence is an ache it knows how to play. 2 weeks later, a voicemail came at 2:47 a.m. My phone blinked like an accusatory pin. The message was in his voice. "Mara," Ray said, and there was the thread of tobacco and apology. "You think you can make rules and run. Keep the ledger. Write when you are afraid. Teach, or write the refusal." When I replayed the message, it rattled in me like a bone. Of course it could have been anything. A hacked recording, a mistake. Technology is porous. The world has holes. But the voicemail arrived at the time Ray had once recorded in the ledger, exactly 2:47 a.m., and that tight pairing of number and memory does something to your reason. It makes coincidence look like pattern. I couldn't ignore the ledger. I tried. I filed property taxes online and paid what I could and promised the bank that I would make it right. The ledger, ridiculous, archaic widger, sat like a magnet on my kitchen counter. I kept jotting entries in it. Small work-a-day notes. Paid some tax. Eli phones 714, agrees to sell truck if necessary. Then an admission. I dream of the glass bending inward. Dreams came and honed their detail. At first they were like flash photography, a face in the window, an animal head pivoting. Then they became longer, scenes stitched into narrative. I would wake with a smell of cedar and something metallic on my lips. My phone buzzed with notifications that I half expected to be calls from people who had not called in years. Once a video clip came through of the lodge, someone else's footage, shaky and bright, with a pair of headlights showing a figure on the porch at 3:14 a.m. No one could trace the sender. The bank called. The tax notices came. My mailbox filled with small legal forms reminding me that inheritance has its teeth. Bills are an ugly kind of attention. The financial anxiety made the lodge's pull worse because practical hardship is a lever this place can pry against. It is easier to tell yourself a house is cursed when you have a late fee stapled to the back of the truth. I visited the lodge twice in the quiet weeks after we fled. Each time the return felt like dipping a finger into a wound.
The house accepted me as if I had left a promise there. It always seemed happier to see me when I obeyed. I reboarded the bowed window because the list said to board it. I sealed the edges with tar because tar is a human thing to do. The mounted heads watched me without complaint, and somehow with more interest. But staying in town didn't make the noise stop. Phone pings at odd hours, videos reposted, a picture of the shoreline when the lake was as flat as a coin, with an extra dark shape at the edge that wasn't in the original photograph. Someone posted a Polaroid of a cup of coffee on the porch and joked about cooling fingers, and then the person deleted it with the speed of someone embarrassed. Social media became a thin, jangly mirror the lodge could rattle. Eli drifted. He could not sleep properly. He moved further and further from the idea of returning. He wanted the ledger handed over to someone else. He wanted the deed to be a packet of legal obligations someone else would take. Our friendship, which had been ballast, stretched thin. He stopped answering midnight texts. "I don't want to be the person you rely on to fix a hole with a prayer," he said once, voice breaking in the way a rope will if you keep tension on it. He left for a month to Vancouver for work, and then to Alaska for a season. He said he needed to reacquaint himself with weather that didn't have grudges. It is in these small departures that the lodge gathers its patience. It doesn't need many people to do its work. It needs the right kind,
the kind that will return with the ledger and a readiness to make the place hospitable again. Months passed. The work was sporadic. I got a job cleaning rooms at a motel off the highway. The pay was cold comfort. At night, my dreams more and more often ended with a friend or a stranger bending a curtain and smiling like a neighbor. It took less time to feel like a person in need of that comfort than I am ashamed to admit. When I finally went back for good, it was because of paperwork and because nothing else seemed to hold on to me. The bank needed answers. A notice about further action arrived in a brown envelope stamped with bold capitals. The ledger had been a leash. The taxes were the hand that pulled. Reed saw me on the lane when I drove up. He was as steady as weather. The same hat, the same slow breath. He held out the thermos and did not lecture me. He only said, "You know what comes next," like an accusation, but soft as a prayer. I moved back in stages, cleaning, fixing, paying off the smallest bills. The lodge seemed pleased. That gratitude was the hardest part. It was not violent. It was like good manners. It was like a person who knows their charm and uses it. I began to find additions to the rule list. There were slips of paper tucked in the back of drawer panels, written late and small in Ray's hand.
They were amendments, not to the core rules, but to their edges, practicalities that suggested the place had had time to make precise demands. If you hear the song at 1:11 in the upstairs guest, do not go, one read. Another lined out, if you leave a light on in the bathroom at 2 a.m., do not linger. These were not dramatic. They were domestic, prosaic, and therefore more dangerous. I learned to be domesticated into being afraid. I learned to love the chore of it. I found a rhythm that was not freedom, but was not terror either. The ledger was no longer only a ledger. It had become the spine of how I measured my days. I added entries, dates of repairs, receipts, the names of people who'd come and gone. I found it less like a tool to keep at bay something and more like a kind of manual for endurance. There was a night when I heard someone on the porch who had once been gone for good, someone who had been in a photograph in Ray's ledger. The voice was not a fresh forgery, but an old tape of a laugh and a half-remembered apology. Rule 6 trembled between my teeth. Do not answer any call that mimics the voice of the dead. I did not answer. I pressed my palm to the ledger like a rosary. Then Kayla came. She was younger than I remembered, bright and reckless in all the ways the lodge hadn't forgiven yet. She messaged me, an Instagram DM that read like a dare. Saw the pics. Staying with you this weekend? Love to get away. Kayla was a distant cousin, one of those branches of family who had the right to be curious and the nerve to be oblivious. You have to understand that when someone says yes in this family, it is a permission and a hazard. I wanted a visitor. I wanted talk and someone who could see me as someone other than the woman who keeps the ledger. I also wanted to test whether being careful now was enough. She came with a duffel and a smile that was like a key. We hugged on the porch and I felt the lodge's gaze like breath against my neck. I taught her the rules in a way that made me feel like a careful teacher, slow, precise, with rehearsal. Number 1, I said, lock doors at sunset. Okay, she laughed and made a show of bolting the deadbolt dramatically. Number 2, I said, if someone knocks after dark, you did not hear it. She nodded, still spilling the kind of eagerness a young person has when they think rules are a game to win. Don't be weird, she teased, but she repeated the words, testing the cadence. Number 3, I said, do not open curtains or blinds between midnight and 3 a.m. She gave me a look. That's oddly specific. I tried to make it practical. I told her about the bowed window and the way the fireplace had used a voice to become persuasive. I told her Reed stories. I told her about Tom Carver and the cup of coffee left untouched as a warning that sounded like gossip. She listened like a city-bred person listening to a good campfire story. Fascinated, amused, tempted. Just treat it like a weird B&B, she said. We first-timers honor the rules, then we laugh about it over pancakes. I should have stopped her when she compared it to a bed and breakfast. I should have said more. I should have insisted she sleep somewhere else. But when someone asks for a place to be, sometimes you want to be the person who gives them shelter. Maybe it is a kindness. Maybe it is weakness. Maybe it is complicity. The ledger doesn't care which one it is. It only counts the result. She stayed the weekend. She posted a single photo to her story, a bright, overexposed shot of the fire with the caption, "Old Lodge Vibes." The picture had 2 likes and a goofy comment from someone at work. She tagged no one. She slept in the guest room on the 2nd floor, the one facing the lake that Ray had written about in the margin. Do not sleep in this room if the window bows. At 1:11 a.m., the guest room got up and sang. It was not singing like people sing.
It was a sound folded from a phone ringtone and a child's lullaby, and the timbre of someone whistling in 3 keys at once. It threaded underneath the boards. It rose from the adjoining room like a siren that had learned someone else's name. Rule Amendment: if you hear the song at 111 in the upstairs guest, do not go. I had read the paper that morning. It had been tucked beneath a ledger flap, and Ray's handwriting had been terse and nervous. I had told Kayla in the daylight that the house has half-truths and you keep your ears clear. She laughed and told me to stop pretending houses weren't alive. At 1:11 a.m., she got up and opened the door. I don't know why she opened it. Maybe youth's curiosity is a spine that will not be bent. Maybe she thought it would be a person who needed help. Maybe she thought she was braver than the place. Maybe she was tired of rules. I could list 1,000 reasons and still be left with the small raw fact. She looked at the curtain. The curtain moved, not because of wind, not because of a rod. It parted as if a tall hand had chosen to be theatrical. The glass reflected something like a shoreline with 2 lights that were not stars. The mounted heads shifted their glass eyes toward the upstairs landing. They were watchers, not decorators. When she opened the door, the hallway filled with something like cold applause. Her face went pale. She looked at me from the landing like someone who had seen a photograph of themselves from an angle they didn't like. She called my name, and the sound the lodge made wasn't her voice. It was a mimic that folded her own laugh into something with other timbre. "Mara," it said, and there was a longness behind the sound, as if someone had taken the syllable and learned how to love it. "Don't," I told her, my throat paper-thin. "Run." She ran the other way. I didn't get to be the person I wanted to be.
I watched from the couch and saw her silhouette bend at the edge of the glass and then unfasten, and then a sharp light in my peripheral, her phone lifting and then dropping, as if she had decided to take one tiny, foolish proof. The story on her feed had one last image, a blurred shot of the lake at night, captioned, "Who knows what I'll find?" The timestamp glowed beneath it, 1:17 a.m. By morning she was gone. I want to say there was a search, an outcry, a town meeting. There was some of that. Kayla's friends posted. The house was on the radar of people who liked true crime. The sheriff asked predictable questions. When was she last seen? Who did she text? We handed over copies of Ray's ledger. The deputies treated it politely like an artifact and then filed it away under family history. I felt like I had handed a surgeon a list of symptoms, and the nurse said, "This is a family thing," as if that could be a diagnostic. I kept the ledger closed for 3 days. It sat on the mantel like a sleeping thing, unconvincing in its stillness. I felt like someone who had been given the key to a system and had been told not to press buttons. Then I went to the guest room. The window was closed and intact. There were no signs of forced entry. There were faint marks on the sill like prints made by a hand that had been careful. Her phone, turned off, was on the bedside table. There were no footprints leading away from the house. There were no other photographs. The motel where I stayed in town got me one email from a person who said they had seen Kayla's car leaving the lodge at 2:03 a.m., but nothing else. The ledger, to be honest, felt heavier after Kayla. The pages smelled like cigarette ash and rain. There was a margin I had never fully read before. A note in Ray's hand dated the year he stopped being able to keep fools away. It said, "If you must teach, teach slow. If you must invite, do not make it easy as a joke. If you refuse to teach, write it on paper. The lodge will learn the curl of your handwriting and may leave you because it cannot be taught to you." On it, in cramped handwriting I recognized instantly, were 3 lines. If they post, watch who likes. The lodge answers publicness. Board social windows. I don't know whether Ray wrote it or whether the house itself had pressed the idea into his hand, but it had a flat intentness, like someone noting a preference. I began to watch the feeds in town. The internet is an unruly place, but the lodge proved adept at using what people posted. It worked with human curiosity. It learned how to amplify it. Kayla's last story got reshared a dozen times. Speculation sprouted, and then shrank into rumor. People came to the property wanting to get warm from the story. They took their pictures on the gravel lane, and then argued over coffee about whether the house was haunted, or whether the family was cruel. I trained myself to be practical. I set up simple measures. The ledger kept the rules, the ledger kept the log. I wrote instructions to myself in block letters. Board main window, 921. Clean out basement, 1010. Wear gloves. Do not answer voicemails from unknown numbers after midnight. I taped the typed sheet back to the mantel and underlined Rule 7 twice. Never let the lodge feel like home. If it does, leave immediately and do not return. And yet the lodge fills the spaces you leave. There's a way a house remembers your absence and then grows around it, like ivy taking the shake of a window. Walking down the hall, I sometimes find my hands reaching for the poker without meaning to. I sometimes feel the urge to feed the fire because the ledger taught me the fire will speak less angrily if it is fed. Acquiescence becomes habit. Habits make identity. The ledger demanded adjustments. I found a new slip of paper tucked beneath the last page, fresh handwriting, not Ray's, but my own, explaining an addition I had made one tired morning. 13. If someone younger asks about staying, tell them you are full. Say no. If they book, inform Reed. The sentence was a lie. I had written it so I could believe it. I taped it into place like a small apology. I do not pretend I am humble keeper. There is something in me that likes being necessary. There is something in me that likes the precision of rules. The ledger gave me a kind of power that felt unspectacular. The ability to keep one small, terrible thing from moving in on the people I loved. The ledger is also a way for the lodge to measure my attention. In exchange for my obedience, it gave me quiet. That quiet is a cunning patience. It may not be mercy. Every so often someone drives up to the gate and leaves an offering. Not that there is any place to post a sign. People make pilgrimages. A bouquet on the porch, a hand-lettered sign with "Gone" on it. They leave candles and notes like little broadcasts to something they don't have the vocabulary to name. The lodge accepts these with the indifference of a thing that has learned people are necessary. Sometimes the ledger reveals more than I want.
A photograph slipped between pages once. Old Polaroid. Ray's handwriting on the back. Tom Carver, 1987. Last seen at midnight. Tom's face in the photo is laughing. His laugh seems to tilt a little wrong. A misalignment between smile and eyes that looks like something learned in a mirror. I keep it in the ledger because paper remembers, and because the house expects me to. People ask why I stay. Reed asked me so I on the porch and watched the lake go flat. He smoked quietly and did not offer sentimentalities. Why did you go back? He asked. There are bills, I said, which is true. And? He pushed. And habits, I admitted. And because if I didn't, someone else might. And because I want to believe I'm keeping it from being worse. He nodded like someone who understands the arithmetic of bad choices. When it teaches you your name, he said, you will like what it calls you. Be careful. Time does strange things when you keep a ledger. It compresses. Small duties accumulate like dust. I found myself writing a new sort of entry, procedural things that read like manual updates. Repaired roof, 11-3. Bought new tar for porch, 11-4. Notified county about derelict dock, 11-5. Counted mounts, 17. Counting is forbidden, but keeping inventory sometimes feels necessary. I never counted them aloud. I wrote the numbers in my head and then crossed them out. The lodge watches the arithmetic of your life and then decides which sums to keep. Years compress. People leave and come back. Eli married someone in a city and we spoke less. Reed died in his bed in winter and left no testament but his thermos and a note about remembering to lock your truck. I went to the funeral and watched his hat on the pew and felt like someone who had been given good advice and then chose not to use it. Once a stranger came to the door with the nerve of a person who thinks curiosity will make them brave. A vlogger, he called himself, and he had a flashy camera and an audible overconfidence. He recorded me saying the rules like a ritual. Lock doors at sunset.
If someone knocks after dark, you did not hear it. He posted a clip. It got shares. The lodge has a way of amplifying attention into invitation. Within a week, the lane had 2 more cars and an overnight tent, and the lodge sat, patient and watchful. One of those newcomers did not leave. The county made noise. The internet argued. The sheriff told me to be careful. The vlogger's last clip was 15 minutes of stag. After that, the channel was quiet. There was a missing persons poster stapled to a telephone pole across town, with his collage of frames and his smile like an advertisement. At dawn, when the light has a color between sleep and truth, I sometimes walk the dock. The lake is a thin place, Ray wrote the words once, where memory is less steady, and the world is porous in a way that is not useful for normal life.
There are stones set along the edge, and when the lake is flat, you can sometimes see a ripple that starts at the shore and moves outward like a word searching for an answer. The ledger made me careful but not unharmed. I kept adding. I taught newcomers the rules, and sometimes I refused. I wrote refusals in block letters and shoved them into envelopes and placed them in the desk of the sheriff. They politely filed them under family matters and closed their folder with the soft, bureaucratic sympathy of someone who knows the limits of the law. If you asked whether I am better or worse for staying, I would say I do not know. I have learned a trade, drafting minor rituals, keeping records, measuring the house's appetite and giving it small portions so it will not notice hunger. I keep the ledger up to date. I write in the margin confessions and instructions. I have copied Ray's practice of making the rule into a habit. It keeps you busy and gives the lodge a shape to learn. Sometimes I wake and the house feels like the skirt of some large, patient animal pressed against me. On those mornings, I look at the typed sheet on the mantel and repeat the rules as if reciting something that is both law and lullaby. Lock exterior doors at sunset, I say aloud. If someone knocks after dark, you did not hear it. Do not open curtains between midnight and 3. If the fireplace lights itself, do not turn away. Do not answer any call that mimics the voice of the dead. Never let the lodge feel like home. I have told people to leave. I have written "I refuse" in a careful script in the ledger when I thought I could no longer obey. The house has a way of accepting or refusing your refusals, depending on the way your handwriting feels. My own script curls into a shape it likes. I have watched the ledger become less a rebellion and more an account of concessions. The last time Kayla's profile updated, it was a ghost of the bright person who had come laughing and curious. Her account posted an image from the lodge, time-stamped later than anyone remembers seeing her. The photo was of the living room with the firelight licking the mantel. A shadow stood in the window. People commented in the thread, some sympathetic, some cruel. No one found her. I went to the ledger and wrote her name on a new line. I wrote the day and a note. Kayla disappeared, noted. Do not let young people stay. If you must instruct them, test their refusals. My hand shook and settled into a slow, deliberate stroke, as if I were signing my interest in the ledger and not in my life. My signature reads like someone who has been taught to obey. In the end, you become what you are surrounded by. The lodge taught me to keep small things tight. The ledger, the rules, the boarded windows. It taught me how to give the right sort of attention. I know the nights by the way the lake breathes and the way the mounts look when someone has a secret. I know when to feed the fire and when to be silent, and when to write my refusal on paper so that the place cannot find purchase in my voice. The last line I added to Ray's ledger was not clever. It was practical and weary. I wrote, "If you must stay, teach the rules. If you cannot, write refusal. Paper remembers." I underlined it because underlining is a habit. There are rules no one talks about. They are not glamorous. They are the small civics of keeping something dangerous manageable. They are the logistics of a bargain you did not intend to make. You lock doors. You keep a ledger. You refuse certain calls. You do not make a house into home. You feed the fire when it asks, and you do not go to the basement when it knocks at 3:33 a.m. You do not let curiosity be the thing that opens a curtain. I have learned, in the slow way of people who keep lists against despair, that keeping things at bay is also a way of living with them. The ledger records births and deaths and repairs and missing people. It lists the names of those who left and those who did not return. It is both a diary and a contract. Sometimes I imagine myself writing the ledger without the lodge's instruction, as if I were writing my own fate into the ink. It is a fanciful notion. Mostly I obey. Mostly I keep the house quiet in the smallest ways. If there is mercy to be had here, it is in specificity, the exactness of a deadbolt, the way tar seals against the rain,
the small discipline of making a note about who visited and what they said. If there is cruelty, it is in the manner the lodge rewards compliance, by teaching you to like being obeyant. I do not believe in triumphant endings. I do not write heroic rescues. I tried the tidy routes and found them arcane. The world does not hand me a solution. It hands me long lists and taxes and nights and lessons. The ledger is my work now. If you ever find yourself wondering about an old family place with a typed sheet on the mantel, listen to the typed sheet. It is less a superstition than a manual, and manuals are useful when you don't want to lose everything. Lock the doors at sunset. If someone knocks after dark, you did not hear it. Keep paper. Teach or write the refusal. I moved into my family's old hunting lodge because I had nowhere to go. I stayed because I was practical and stubborn, and because the ledger taught me the smallest kind of care. There are days I wish I had left for good. There are nights when the ache of missing a world outside the lake is unbearable. But there are rules no one talks about. The ones between the printed ones. The ones that are taught in the ledger's margins. They say, count your complicities. Keep a light on for no one. Board what bows. Tell the next person you refuse if you cannot teach them. And above all, remember that paper remembers. If you'd like notes on the ledger, a reading list, or where I found Ray's last tape, check the description below.